The city was alive with the sounds of rush hour. Horns blared, and the streets were filled with the chaotic hustle of people returning home after a long day. For Dr. Lena Harris, however, the day was far from over. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat as she maneuvered through the sea of cars, the hospital's emergency line flashing across the screen. "Dr. Harris, we need you immediately," came the voice of a frantic nurse from St. Michael's Hospital. "We've got a 10-year-old boy in critical condition, ruptured appendix. He's deteriorating fast." Lena felt her pulse quicken. Surgery was her domain, her sanctuary, and it was where she thrived. She'd been through countless emergency procedures, but there was something about a child on the operating table that always struck a different chord. "I'm on my way," she replied, pressing her foot harder on the accelerator. The street seemed to clear as if the universe itself knew how important every second was. She switched on her emergency lights, her car weaving through the evening traffic with precision. As she approached the hospital, she was already mentally reviewing the steps of the surgery. Her team would be preparing the operating room, getting the instruments sterilized, and setting up the anesthesia. She trusted them completely, but the key player in this moment was her. She had to be there. Lena's hospital ID sat in the cup holder next to her as she pulled up to the entrance of St. Michael's. She barely noticed the familiar imposing building or the people milling about the hospital's main doors. All she could think about was the young boy inside, his life hanging in the balance. One misstep, one delay, and the consequences could be devastating. She parked quickly and grabbed her ID, rushing toward the entrance. But just as she reached the glass doors, a figure stepped in her way, a tall man in a dark security uniform, his arms crossed over his chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm but flat. "Where do you think you're going in such a hurry?" Lena blinked, momentarily thrown off. Her mind had been so focused on the surgery that she hadn't even registered the man's presence until now. She held up her hospital ID, the words "Dr. Lena Harris, Chief Surgeon," clearly printed beneath her photo. "I'm Dr. Harris. I have an emergency surgery to perform," she said, keeping her tone professional but urgent. She tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her path again. The officer, whose name tag read Hanson, squinted at the ID before giving Lena a once-over, his eyes narrowing. "I don't recognize you. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Lena froze for a split second, processing the question. It wasn't the first time she'd been doubted or questioned in her career, but now was not the time. She tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand. "Yes, I work here," she said, keeping her voice measured. "I'm the lead surgeon on call. A young boy is in critical condition, and I need to get inside right now." But Hanson didn't budge. His skeptical gaze traveled from her face down to her clothes, a casual jacket thrown hastily over her scrubs, and back again. Lena's heart sank as she recognized the familiar flicker of doubt in his expression. "I'm going to need to verify that," he said, glancing at his radio. Lena's pulse quickened. "Officer Hanson, there's no time for that. You can call whoever you need to, but I need to be inside that hospital now. A child's life is at stake." Her words should have been enough to convey the urgency of the situation, but Hanson remained unmoved, his stance unyielding. He reached for his radio, seemingly oblivious to the ticking seconds slipping away. Lena fought to keep her composure, but her frustration was mounting. Every minute she spent standing here was a minute the boy's condition worsened. She could picture the sterile operating room, the machines beeping urgently, her team waiting for her to arrive. She had always prided herself on remaining calm in stressful situations, but this was different. "Listen," she said, her voice now edged with desperation. "I am Dr. Harris, and I don't have time for this. If you don't let me through, a child could die. Do you understand that?" Hanson finally looked up from his radio, his expression hardening. "I understand the importance of hospital security, and I'm just following protocol. If you really are who you say you are, we'll get it sorted out." Lena stared at him, incredulous. Protocol? Was he serious? She could feel the precious seconds slipping away like sand through her fingers. She needed to be in that operating room. "Please," she said, softening her tone in an attempt to reason with him. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to do my job." But Hanson remained a stone wall. "You'll need to wait until I confirm your identity." he said, his voice firm. At that moment, a nurse from inside the hospital rushed out, her face pale with worry. "Dr. Harris," she called, spotting Lena immediately. "We need you in the OR. The boy's condition is worsening. There's no time." Lena shot Hanson a final look of frustration before moving past him and into the hospital, her mind now fully on the surgery ahead. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. As she rushed toward the operating room, Lena felt a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling inside her. She'd been delayed, questioned, and doubted, all because someone couldn't see past their own assumptions, and all while a child's life hung in the balance. But there was no time to think about that now. She had a job to do. Officer Hanson stood by the entrance, watching as the nurse and Dr. Harris disappeared into the hospital. His stomach churned uneasily. Something about the entire situation felt off. He had followed protocol, right? He had to ensure the safety of the hospital and its staff. But the urgency in her voice, the panic in the nurse's eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. He glanced down at his radio, the conversation with the hospital staff still playing out in his ear. They had just confirmed Dr. Harris's identity. She was exactly who she said she was, chief surgeon, one of the hospital's most respected doctors. A wave of guilt washed over him as he realized what he had done. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere buzzed with controlled urgency. Nurses rushed through the hallways with medical carts. Doctors reviewed charts and made critical decisions, and the low hum of machinery filled the air. Dr. Lena Harris's thoughts were racing as she made her way to the operating room. She could still feel the frustration and disbelief from the encounter with Officer Hanson, but she pushed it aside. There was no time to dwell on it. Right now, she had one goal: saving the young boy who lay on the operating table. As she entered the surgical wing, the familiar smells of antiseptic and sterilized instruments grounded her. Her team had been prepping for the surgery, and she knew they'd be ready for her. They always were. Lena quickly scrubbed in, her hands moving methodically, washing away the remnants of the outside world. Each stroke of the brush on her skin reminded her to focus on the task at hand. But the nagging thought of the delay crept into her mind. Those lost minutes could cost the boy his life. Just as she was finishing, her colleague, Dr. Emily Carter, rushed up to her, her eyes wide with concern. "Lena, we need to move fast," Emily said, handing her the latest report on the boy's condition. "His vitals are dropping, and his appendix is ruptured. We've got a small window here." Lena nodded, taking in the information as she dried her hands. She pushed through the door into the operating room, where the boy lay on the table, unconscious, his small chest rising and falling weakly. The machines around him beeped steadily, but the numbers on the monitor told a grim story. Time was slipping away faster than she had feared. "Let's get started," Lena said firmly, her voice calm despite the urgency. The surgical team immediately snapped into action, prepping the boy for surgery as Lena reviewed the necessary steps in her mind. This was a routine procedure, but the complications caused by the rupture meant every moment counted. The operating room was a world unto itself, insulated from the chaos of the outside world. Here, time moved differently. Seconds felt like hours, and the weight of each decision pressed down on everyone in the room. The boy's life was in their hands, and the smallest mistake could have devastating consequences. But Lena had been here before, many times. She trusted her instincts, and she trusted her team. As she began the incision, her mind focused sharply on the task at hand. The outside world faded away. The confrontation with Officer Hanson, the rush to get inside, all of it dissolved. It was just her, the boy, and the surgery. Minutes passed in a blur of precise movements. The surgical team worked seamlessly together, the only sounds in the room the steady beeping of the machines and the soft murmurs of medical jargon. The ruptured appendix was worse than Lena had anticipated, and the boy's body had already started to show signs of infection. She had to move quickly to remove the infected tissue before it spread further. But as Lena worked, a sense of unease crept over her. No matter how skilled she was, there was always the unknown, the unpredictable factors that could turn even the most routine procedure into a life-or-death struggle. And this time, they were already behind schedule. Her hands moved swiftly and expertly, but her mind couldn't help but replay the encounter at the hospital's entrance. Every minute she had spent arguing with Officer Hanson was a minute that could have made all the difference. The boy's condition had deteriorated in the time it took to resolve the situation, and now Lena was fighting against the clock, trying to undo the damage. Outside the operating room, Officer Hanson paced near the hospital entrance, replaying the interaction with Dr. Harris in his mind. The confirmation of her identity had come moments after she had rushed inside, and now the weight of his actions was beginning to settle in. He had followed protocol, yes, but had he really done the right thing? Had his hesitation, his judgment, cost that boy precious time? He couldn't shake the look in Dr. Harris's eyes, the urgency, the frustration, the desperation. It wasn't the first time Greg Hanson had encountered a tense situation at the hospital doors, but this one felt different. He had doubted her without cause, assuming she didn't belong, even as she had pleaded with him to let her through. And now, a child's life was at stake. Hanson leaned against the wall, his radio buzzing with the usual chatter from other security personnel, but he wasn't listening. His mind was fixated on the thought that maybe, just maybe, his assumptions had led him down the wrong path. He had been trained to maintain security, to question everyone, to ensure the hospital remained safe. But today, he wondered if his actions had been more harmful than helpful. Back in the operating room, Lena and her team were nearing the critical point in the surgery. The infected appendix had been removed, and now they were working to clean the surrounding area and prevent further complications. The boy's vitals were still unstable, and the infection had spread more than Lena had initially realized. But she wasn't about to give up. Not yet. "Vitals are still dropping," one of the nurses said, her voice tight with concern. "Keep them steady," Lena replied, her focus unbroken. "We're almost there." Every second felt like a lifetime as they worked to stabilize the boy. Sweat beaded on Lena's forehead, but she didn't let it distract her. She had to keep going. She had to finish what she started. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the soft whispers of the medical team. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy's vitals began to stabilize. The infection had been contained, and the immediate danger had passed. Lena exhaled a long, slow breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. She glanced around at her team, who wore the same exhausted expressions of triumph. They had done it. But as Lena stepped away from the operating table and began to remove her gloves, the weight of what had happened outside the operating room came crashing down on her. She had saved the boy's life, but the delay caused by Officer Hanson's actions had nearly cost him everything. Lena knew that in her line of work, time was often the difference between life and death, and today, that truth had never been clearer. As she walked out of the operating room, Lena felt a surge of emotions: relief, anger, exhaustion. She had done her job, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't needed to be this close. The boy was alive, but for how long had he been on the brink? And why had she been forced to fight through barriers that never should have been there in the first place? She needed air. She needed to clear her head. Outside, Officer Hanson was still pacing, lost in his thoughts. When he saw Dr. Harris emerge from the surgical wing, his stomach tightened with guilt. He knew he had to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He had been wrong, and now he had to face the consequences of that mistake. Lena didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in her own thoughts. But as she made her way toward the exit, her eyes caught his, and the look on his face said it all. He knew. Lena paused, her eyes locking with Officer Hanson's as she stood in the hallway. The exhaustion from the surgery weighed heavily on her, but the surge of emotions was even heavier. She had just fought to save a child's life, but the reality of what had happened at the hospital entrance still simmered inside her, unresolved and raw. Hanson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before looking back up at Lena. There was no mistaking the guilt in his expression. He took a hesitant step forward, opening his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out at first. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline of the surgery still coursing through her veins, but now mingled with the frustration of the delay and the lingering sense of injustice. I didn't realize. Hanson finally muttered, his voice low and hesitant. "I didn't know you were the lead surgeon. I thought you were someone else. I'm sorry." Lena's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't the first time she'd heard apologies like this, and she doubted it would be the last. But what gnawed at her wasn't just the delay. It was the deeper issue behind it. She had worked her entire career to be the best at what she did. Yet, in a critical moment, it had almost meant nothing because of someone's assumptions. "Sorry?" she echoed, her voice controlled but sharp. "Sorry doesn't give me back the minutes you took away. Do you know how close that boy was to dying?" Hanson flinched, his guilt deepening as her words hit him with full force. He hadn't thought of it in those terms, but now it seemed painfully clear. His hesitation, his judgment, could have cost that boy his life. "I was just following protocol," Hanson said defensively, though even as the words left his mouth, he realized how hollow they sounded. Lena shook her head, her exhaustion giving way to anger. "Protocol?" she repeated, incredulous. "Your protocol is to stop doctors from saving lives? Because that's exactly what you did." Hanson's face flushed. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, that he was just trying to do his job. But the reality was, he had made an assumption about her, and that assumption had nearly led to disaster. There was no escaping that fact. "I didn't think someone like you," Hanson began, but he stopped mid-sentence, realizing how wrong that sounded. "Someone like me?" Lena's voice cut through the air like a knife, and Hanson winced at the words he hadn't meant to say. But they were out there now, hanging between them, revealing the truth of his thinking. "I didn't mean it like that," Hanson said quickly, scrambling to fix his mistake. I don't know. I didn't expect." Lena felt her chest tighten, the frustration building as the weight of the day pressed down on her. "You didn't expect what? That I could be the one saving a life? That I could be in charge? That I belonged here?" Hanson opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find the words to answer her questions. Lena could see the struggle on his face, but it didn't soften the anger she felt. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be reduced to someone's snap judgment. "This isn't about you," Lena said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "It's about that boy. You almost cost him his life. Do you understand that?" Hanson swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I get it," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how urgent it was. I didn't realize." But Lena didn't let him finish. "No, you didn't," she interrupted. "You didn't realize because you saw what you wanted to see, and that almost cost everything." For a moment, the hallway was silent. Hanson shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Lena's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had thought he was just doing his job, following procedure, but now it was clear how deeply he had failed. Not just in stopping her, but in seeing her as less than what she was. Lena took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had no time for this, not after what she had just been through. There were still patients to see, and her shift wasn't over. But the anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, and she couldn't let it go so easily. "I don't need your apology," she said finally, her voice cool. "What I need is for this never to happen again, to me or anyone else." Hanson nodded again, this time more firmly. "It won't," he promised, though the guilt in his eyes made it clear that he wasn't sure how to make that happen. Lena turned to leave, her body exhausted from the surgery and the emotional weight of the encounter. But as she took a step toward the exit, she paused, her back still to Hanson. "And Officer Hanson," she said, her voice steady but firm, "I suggest you think long and hard about why you made the assumptions you did today." With that, Lena walked away, leaving Hanson standing in the hallway, his mind racing. He had spent years in his job, enforcing rules, keeping people out, and ensuring the safety of the hospital. But today had shaken something inside him. He had assumed that Lena, a black woman in scrubs, couldn't possibly be the lead surgeon. And that assumption had nearly led to tragedy. As Hanson stood there watching her disappear down the corridor, he realized that this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about everything he had been trained to think. Every unconscious bias he carried with him. He had a lot to learn, and it started now. Lena stepped out into the crisp evening air, letting the cold bite at her skin as she took a deep breath. The tension in her body slowly began to ease, but the frustration lingered. She had spent her entire life fighting to prove her worth, to be seen for her skills and accomplishments rather than her appearance. And yet, moments like this reminded her how much further there was to go. She walked toward her car, the city lights glowing in the distance. The day had been long and exhausting, but the boy was alive. That was what mattered most. Still, the encounter with Officer Hanson weighed on her. It wasn't just the inconvenience of being delayed. It was the deeper implication that no matter how much she achieved, there would always be someone questioning her place. As she reached her car and unlocked the door, Lena glanced back at the hospital, its tall windows reflecting the city's lights. This was her world, the world where she saved lives and made a difference. But it was also a world where she had to fight to be recognized for what she was truly capable of. Sliding into the driver's seat, Lena exhaled slowly, the day's events swirling in her mind. The boy was safe. The surgery had been successful. But there was still so much work to be done, both in the hospital and beyond its walls. She started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The city's streets unfolding before her. There would be more surgeries, more lives to save, and more battles to fight. But tonight, Lena allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. She had proven her worth. And nothing, not even someone's narrow view of her, could take that away. Officer Greg Hanson stood frozen in the hallway long after Dr. Lena Harris had disappeared around the corner. His feet felt as heavy as the weight on his chest, which only grew with each passing second. The quiet hum of the hospital, the distant murmur of nurses and doctors going about their routines, barely registered in his mind. All he could hear was her voice, each sharp word she'd said replaying in his head. "You almost cost a child his life." The words stung, and no matter how hard he tried to shake them, they lingered, gnawing at his conscience. He had spent years on the job, following protocols, maintaining order at the hospital's entrance. But in that moment, when it had mattered most, he had failed. Not because he didn't do his job, but because he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. Greg swallowed hard, running a hand over the back of his neck as he paced the hallway. He had seen her hospital ID, heard her claim to be a doctor, but something had stopped him from believing her right away. He couldn't deny it any longer. It wasn't just about following rules or making sure everyone entering the hospital was supposed to be there. It was something deeper, something he hadn't wanted to confront before now. He thought back to their exchange at the entrance. He'd questioned her, doubted her. And for what? Because she didn't look like what he thought a surgeon should look like? Because she was a black woman standing in front of him, demanding to be let in to do her job? It was an ugly truth, but one he couldn't escape anymore. He had judged her. He had seen her skin, her appearance, and made a snap decision, one that could have cost that child his life. His stomach twisted at the thought. If that boy had died on the operating table, Greg knew he would never be able to forgive himself. The weight of that possibility made his knees weak. Greg walked over to a nearby bench and sat down heavily, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that he was doing the right thing by following procedure. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he realized how blind he had been. Blind to his own biases, his own prejudices. And in a job like his, that blindness could be deadly. He rubbed his hands over his face, trying to shake the thoughts that swirled in his mind. But no matter what he did, they kept coming back to the same point. He had been wrong. And not just wrong, but deeply, fundamentally wrong about her. Greg took a deep breath and leaned back against the bench, staring up at the ceiling. He had always thought of himself as a good person, someone who treated people fairly, regardless of who they were. But today had shown him just how much he still had to learn. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He had made an assumption about Dr. Harris because of her race, and it had nearly caused a tragedy. "I didn't expect someone like you," he had said. The words echoed in his mind, each time sounding worse than before. He had meant it in a harmless way, or so he thought at the time. But now he could see how much harm those words carried. Someone like you, as if her appearance could define her abilities or her worth. It was a bitter realization, one that left a hollow feeling in his chest. As he sat there, the sounds of the hospital fading in and out, Greg found himself thinking back to his early days as a security officer. He had taken pride in his job, in being the one who kept things safe and orderly. But over the years, he had grown complacent, relying on assumptions and gut feelings, rather than taking the time to see people for who they really were. And today, those assumptions had nearly cost everything. Greg stood up slowly, his legs still shaky beneath him. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't fix what had happened, but he could own up to it. He needed to apologize to Dr. Harris, not just for delaying her entry, but for the underlying reason behind it. He needed her to know that he understood, that he was committed to doing better. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it was the only way to make sure something like this never happened again. He made his way toward the surgical wing, his heart pounding with each step. He didn't know if Dr. Harris would be willing to hear him out, or if she'd even want to speak to him at all. But he owed her the effort, and he owed her the truth. As he approached the surgical ward, Greg spotted one of the nurses who had rushed out to find Dr. Harris earlier. The nurse recognized him immediately, her expression cautious but unreadable. "Is Dr. Harris still around?" Greg asked, his voice quieter than usual. The nurse nodded, though her eyes flicked to his security badge with a hint of suspicion. "She's in the recovery room with the boy's family. He's stable now, thanks to her." Greg felt a wave of relief wash over him. The boy had made it. Dr. Harris had saved him, despite the time that had been lost. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Do you think I could speak with her when she's done?" he asked, his voice laced with guilt. The nurse studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll let her know you're waiting." Greg thanked her and stepped aside, leaning against the wall as he waited. His mind raced with what he wanted to say, but no matter how he phrased it in his head, nothing seemed right. How could he put into words the depth of his mistake? How could he possibly explain that he hadn't just delayed her, but that he had doubted her, and in doing so, had disrespected everything she had worked for? He waited, minutes stretching on, as the recovery room's door remained closed. Each second that passed felt heavier than the last, his guilt building as he imagined what could have happened if the surgery hadn't been successful. Finally, the door opened, and Dr. Lena Harris stepped out, looking tired but calm. Her eyes scanned the hallway, landing on Greg. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Greg felt his stomach twist with nerves. He straightened up as she approached, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dr. Harris," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. She didn't say anything, just raised an eyebrow, clearly waiting for him to continue. I wanted to apologize," Greg said, his words stumbling out faster than he intended. "I was wrong. I was following protocol, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I made assumptions about you that I shouldn't have, and I know I nearly cost that boy his life." Lena's face remained unreadable, her expression cool and controlled. Greg felt the weight of her silence pressing down on him, but he pushed through, determined to say what he had come here to say. "I didn't see you for who you are, and that's on me," Greg continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been on this job for a long time, and I thought I was doing things the right way. But today I realized how wrong I've been. I'm sorry, Dr. Harris. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm going to do better. I have to." For a moment, Lena said nothing. She studied him, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his sincerity. Greg could feel his pulse racing, waiting for her response, unsure if she would accept his apology or walk away. Finally, Lena sighed softly and spoke. "I appreciate your apology," she said, her voice measured. "But this isn't just about you apologizing to me. It's about changing how you see people. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect and consideration, regardless of how they look." Greg nodded quickly, absorbing her words. "I understand, and I will change. I promise." Lena gave him a small nod, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Good, because lives depend on it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Greg standing alone in the hallway once again. But this time the weight on his chest felt different. Not a burden of guilt, but the responsibility to do better. He had made a mistake, but now he had the chance to learn from it. As he watched her disappear down the corridor, Greg vowed to never let his assumptions cloud his judgment again. The days that followed felt different for Officer Greg Hanson. Every shift he worked at the hospital brought a new layer of awareness, a fresh understanding of the gravity of his responsibilities. Each face that walked through the doors now held more meaning. It wasn't just about keeping the hospital safe anymore. It was about seeing people for who they were, not who he assumed them to be. He stood at his usual post by the entrance, watching doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors pass by. But now, instead of the usual detached observations he had once made, Greg found himself thinking about the stories behind each person. Who were they? What battles were they fighting? What had brought them here? His interaction with Dr. Lena Harris had shaken something deep inside him. He had replayed that encounter over and over again, examining his own behavior and the assumptions that had guided it. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Lena's words had echoed in his mind. This isn't just about you apologizing to me. It's about changing how you see people. That change was starting to take hold, though Greg knew he still had a long way to go. Dr. Lena Harris returned to her usual routine at St. Michael's Hospital, but the encounter with Officer Hanson lingered in her thoughts. She had faced discrimination in subtle and overt ways throughout her career, but something about this experience felt different. It had been a stark reminder of the biases that still existed, even in places like hospitals, where the priority should always be saving lives. She had spent years proving her worth, her skill, her expertise, her dedication to her patients. Yet moments like that confrontation with Hanson reminded her that no matter how far she had come, there would always be those who saw her skin before they saw her credentials. But Lena wasn't one to dwell on bitterness. She had a job to do, and it was a job she loved. Every surgery, every patient, every life saved was a testament to her determination and her ability to rise above the obstacles thrown her way. She was proud of what she had accomplished, and she wasn't about to let one moment define her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in Hanson, but in herself. She had stood up for herself in a way that felt different this time. It wasn't just about defending her right to be in that operating room. It was about demanding to be seen, to be respected for who she was and what she could do. And in doing so, she had planted a seed of change in someone else. One afternoon, about a week after the incident, Greg saw Lena walk through the hospital doors again. She moved with the same calm confidence that had struck him the first time, her scrubs neatly pressed, her hospital ID swinging slightly as she walked. For a moment, Greg hesitated, unsure if he should approach her or let her pass without a word. But he had made a promise to himself that day, a promise to do better, to be better. And part of that meant acknowledging the work he still needed to do. "Dr. Harris," Greg called, his voice respectful but clear. Lena turned, her gaze falling on him. There was no immediate flash of recognition in her eyes, but Greg could see that she was prepared for whatever interaction was coming next. "I wanted to thank you," Greg said, stepping closer, though still keeping a respectful distance. "For what you said to me. You were right. I didn't see you for who you are, and I've been working to change that." Lena studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Greg couldn't tell if she was skeptical or simply waiting for him to continue. "I've been on this job a long time," Greg continued, "and I thought I knew everything about keeping people safe. But I was wrong about a lot of things. You helped me realize that, and I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to see things differently now." Lena gave a small nod, her eyes softening just a fraction. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. But as long as you're committed to it, that's what matters." Greg felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure what he had expected from this conversation, but the fact that Lena had acknowledged his efforts was more than he had hoped for. "I won't forget what happened," Lena added, her tone gentle but firm. "But I also believe in giving people the chance to grow. If you're serious about changing, then that's a good start." Greg nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I am," he promised, "and I'll keep working on it." Lena gave him a brief, thoughtful smile before turning to head toward the elevators. Greg watched her go, feeling a sense of resolution settle over him. It wasn't about proving anything to her. It was about holding himself accountable to the promises he had made. Weeks passed, and Greg continued his duties at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. He became more aware of the interactions he had with patients, staff, and visitors. He took the time to listen, to see people beyond their outward appearances, and to approach each situation with an open mind. He even began attending workshops on unconscious bias, wanting to better understand how those hidden prejudices could affect his work and the people around him. The more he learned, the more he realized how much work there was to do, not just for himself but for society as a whole. But he was ready to take that on. One evening, as Lena was leaving the hospital after a particularly grueling shift, she spotted Greg standing at his post. She hadn't seen him much in the weeks since their last conversation, but she had heard from some of the nurses that he was making an effort to change. They had noticed the shift in his behavior, the way he interacted with people, the thoughtfulness he now brought to his job. Lena walked toward the doors, her body aching from the long day, but her mind alert. Greg saw her approaching and gave her a small, respectful nod. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt in his eyes. He knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, he saw her for who she was. Lena nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the growth they had both experienced. She walked through the doors and into the cool evening air, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The journey wasn't over for either of them, but it was a step forward. Greg watched her leave, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had come a long way since that day at the hospital entrance, and he knew he still had a long way to go. But now, he was ready to face that journey with open eyes and an open heart. As the night began to fall and the city's lights flickered on, Greg stood at his post, more certain than ever that change, while difficult, was possible. And sometimes it started with a single conversation.